Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back for our third and final international roundtable session. So this session, much like the others, we will encourage audience questions and participation. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat box and we'll get them answered. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters for the session. So today's last roundtable will focus on the Irish energy storage market. So obviously a very, very hot and interesting market at the moment. So our panelists today are Benita Doyle, who is the head of grid services for Statkraft Ireland and also representing Energy Storage Ireland. And then we have Frank Burke, who is the technical advisor at the Irish Energy Storage Association and also Loncloon Energy. So I'd just like to say, as always, a huge thank you to our sponsors and our partners for helping make the event a great success. And we really hope everybody's enjoyed the session so far. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand right over to Frank and we'll get on with the presentation.
Hello. Yes, thank you for the introduction, Lucy. So I'll dive straight into it. And these are just a number of slides to give you some ideas about the energy storage market in Ireland, and to some extent why it's maybe a little bit different to some other countries. And it's really just to stimulate the discussion afterwards. So why is the market in Ireland a little bit different? Renewable generation gives rise to two issues, and the first one I think everybody knows about is the intermittent and our unpredictable output of the renewable generation, and that requires energy balancing. But there's a second issue that is a bigger issue for Ireland that hasn't really been seen as much in other countries, and that's the lack of inertia or grid stability. And why is that an issue? Traditionally, the grid stability has been provided by conventional plants with heavy generators and steam turbines or gas turbines thundering around at 3,000 RPM. That's 50 revolutions a second, which is why it's 50 hertz. And that produces a lot of momentum to stabilize the grid, so the grid can kind of ride through the bumps. Now, the more wind and PV that's on the grid, the less room there is for this conventional plant to provide that stability. So you need something else to provide that stability, and that's where energy storage comes in. So the focus in Ireland at the moment is on energy storage for grid stability, and that's things like batteries and flywheels and ultracapacitors. It's mainly batteries, although there have been some demonstration projects with flywheels and ultracapacitors. If you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you'll get an example of a real frequency event where the frequency is going along fairly nicely between 49.9 and 50.1, but then suddenly there's a big dip in the frequency. And why is this such a big problem in Ireland? It's because we're an island and we don't have any AC interconnection. So we've no synchronous connection with other countries. So that means that any heavy generation in other countries doesn't actually help us. It's only the heavy plants that we have in Ireland. So if the system frequency drops very quickly, before the heavy generators could ride through the bumps, but now you need something that will respond very, very rapidly. And you can see how steeply the system frequency falls and comes back up again. And the other graph is just an indication of how many events there might be during the year. So you can go on to the next slide, Lucy. So there's a program called DS3, which stands for Delivering a Secure and Sustainable System in Ireland. And it's really all to do with system services, or what used to be called ancillary services. So the relevant ones here in terms of grid stability are these ones here from fast frequency response, which is the response that a battery or any other conventional plant either can give between 2 seconds after the start of an event where the system frequency takes a dip and 10 seconds. And then there's primary operating reserve, secondary, tertiary 1, tertiary 2, and so on. And they are just different time frames for effectively the same kind of response from a battery or from a generator. And if you look at the diagram on the left-hand side, you see synchronous inertial response before the fast frequency response. And that's the kind of thing that I was talking about before that helps to ride through the bumps. But the plant has to be synchronous to do that. Now, batteries, flywheels, all of those things are not synchronous. They go through power electronics, so they can't provide that synchronous inertial response. But you can have a plant like synchronous condensers that will do that. The energy storage in terms of, say, batteries or other plants can also provide the replacement or reserve, the RM1, 3 and 8, which is different, much longer time frames. But if you're using batteries, maybe you can get the 1 to 3 hours, but anything more than that, you would want to use a different kind of battery or different kinds of technology. Maybe the next slide, please. So the market, how does the market, this DS3 market work in Ireland? People are paid, the providers of these services are paid to be available to provide a service. So it's not dependent on the number of frequency events. So if I have a battery plant, I can, and the battery plant is available to provide these system services, I get paid for its availability. And I get paid depending on the different services that I can provide. So if you look at the table on the left, and the second one, primary operating reserve, for every hour that I am available, for every megawatt, I get €3.24, okay? And then if I can provide secondary operating reserve, I get an additional 196 for that, and so on. So the actual payments depend on the volume, how many megawatts, by the payment rate, which is these rates for each of the different services, by scaling factors. Now, the scaling factors are to incentivize plants for things like a faster response to the fast frequency response. I said the fast frequency response was from 2 seconds out to 10 seconds. That's mandatory. But if you can offer a response within 150 milliseconds rather than 2 seconds, you get 3 times the rate. So there's a scaling factor of 3. So maybe come on to the next slide. So what's the extent of the requirements for energy storage in Ireland? The 2020 renewable electricity target was 40%, and we made nearly the 40%. Now that 40% is an average over the year, but because the output isn't steady over the whole year, the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, then the instantaneous level needs to be 75% to get the average of 40% over the year. That means that 75% of the electricity was being produced by wind, largely wind in Ireland. And there was only room for 25% of synchronous plant. And that's why the issue for energy storage in Ireland at the moment is grid stability. The 2030 target is 70% on average over the year, which means an instantaneous level of 90 or probably 95% at times. So that gives an even bigger problem in terms of grid stability, but also energy balancing starts to come into the picture as well, which implies long duration storage as well as the short duration storage that's there at the moment. And by 2050 with carbon neutral, then we will also need very long duration storage, maybe of the order of 10 days. And the next slide. So just a few other things about the market for energy storage in Ireland. There are no subsidies or tax incentives for energy storage. As I said, the current focus is on the provision of system services. There was an auction in 2019 for 6-year contracts, and they gave out contracts for 110 megawatts. All of the other plants have to come in on a tariff regime which will run until 2023. One of the difficulties of that is you have to actually have the plant built before you get the contract, and that can make funding quite difficult. There are future arrangements, there are consultations taking place for what happens after 2023. And what's proposed is that there would be a day-ahead auction. And this would be quite complex and will be a huge change in the market. In terms of long duration batteries, they can get the energy revenue from the energy market and also from the capacity market. The capacity market, the plant is derated depending on the number of hours storage. So if you have, say, a half an hour storage, it's only 100 megawatts would only count for about 20 megawatts. The other use for energy storage would be relieving grid congestion. There is no market mechanism for doing that to date, but it's being considered. And there are opportunities behind the meter, both for, say, co-location with wind and solar, and also behind the meter for large industrial customers. And the last slide. This is just an indication of the different kinds of energy storage and the applications that they can be used for. So the current focus is on lithium-ion batteries, mainly half hour up to 2 hours, but it could go to 4 hours. And you can see here the applications, things like grid stability, system services, energy balancing, grid congestion, and so on. And then flow batteries have a slightly different range of applications, and flywheels and ultracapacitors are really only for grid stability, and synchronous condensers, which I mentioned, for inertia and fault current. And then you've got pumped hydro and compressed air and liquid air and so on, which is the longer duration stuff. So that's more around energy balancing and capacity and a little bit of system services. So I'll pass you over to Bernice now.
Thanks, Frank. I will just kind of build on maybe a couple of the points that Frank made, and then we can throw it open for a general discussion. In terms of the big picture, Frank has talked about the targets and where we're going to. So we've achieved our 40% RESI target in 2020, which was a fantastic achievement, in fairness, and a lot of that down to the great work that has been done since 2011 in the DS3 programme. But now we've got our 2030 targets to move forward on, and we've got that 70% RESI target in the Climate Action Plan. In ROI, in NI, that target isn't quite set yet, but certainly the direction of travel that we see from Diane Dodds is that it will be at least of a similar order to what is there for ROI. But on top of that, there's also an annual emissions reduction target, which has been agreed in the Irish Programme for Government and is currently running through the legislative process. And that's to achieve a 7% per annum annual emissions reduction between now and 2030. And that becomes really important, actually, when we start talking about the future of system services in Ireland. Alongside that, there's been a lot of updates in the last year or two on the strategies. EirGrid, the regulators north and south, and the SEM committee, which oversees the DS3 procurement framework. All of those updates have put low carbon outcomes and decarbonisation as a central plank, and that's really important for where we need to go next. Maybe moving on then, Lucy, to the next slide. So the latest developments in the market in Ireland, just to maybe flag a couple of those. Back in December, EirGrid published a DS3 expenditure note, and that was really to say that, look, we've got this tariff regime, it's a payment, as Frank described, for availability to provide system services, but we see that the build out in order to meet the requirement for reserves is now happening, and actually our technical requirement for fast reserves is now, or will very shortly be, met from non-conventional sources. So between the amount of capacity contracted by DSUs and batteries which are built or building, ERGRID are indicating that the technical requirements, so the market in Ireland is quite shallow. It's about a 400 megawatt technical requirement as things stand today for fast reserves. And it looks like that amount of batteries alone will be built by the end of this year. So they're concerned about their budget. The current budget cap for Ireland on DS3 is 235 million. But at the same time, there has been a PR5 decision, and this is the price review process that's undergone by the system operators in Ireland, and the most recent one has just had a decision recently. And what's that has done for the first time is where Frank outlined the targets for 2030 to get to 70% RESI and 95% SNSP. This is the first time that actually we've seen an interim target between those 2 points. So the CRU is specifically incentivizing ERGRID as the system operator to reach 85% SNSP by 2025. So that's an important point, because the DS3 budget of 235 million was based on a 2020 target of 40% RESI and 75% SNSP. So if we're being told now, that we're ramping up to 95% in 2030, but actually we're ramping to 85% in 2025, then certainly the system services framework and budget needs to adjust accordingly. So last slide then from my side, I think, is just looking at where things are at. So the future arrangements for system services, that scoping paper was out last summer, responses in September of 2020. The Climate Action Plan mandates the CRU to come up with a model for future procurement of system services by Q1 of this year. Now that target is clearly not going to be met. That's been accepted by both the regulators and ERGRID. And so the question is, what happens next? Certainly, everyone agrees the need to move to transition to those kind of shorter term auction-based procurements. But I suppose the thing that seems very ambitious, as Frank mentioned, is that in contrast to GB, for example, where the fast frequency reserve products started out as a fixed contract for 4 years, moved to a monthly, and they will progress to probably weekly and eventually daily. In Ireland, the proposal is to jump straight from a fixed contract or tariff-based contract to a kind of a day-ahead type arrangement. So that seems particularly ambitious and difficult to deliver in the timelines. So we think that interim measures will be needed, because obviously we're facing this cliff edge or end of the current arrangements in April 2023. So lots of work to be done to both define that future arrangements and how we get there in terms of the detail of that procurement, but also, what do we do in the interim in order to keep us on track, not just for 2030, but for 2025. So I think that was it from my slides.
Great, thank you so much, Bernice, and thanks, Frank, as well. So I think that was a great sort of scene-setting overview of the Irish market, and obviously 2 things that I'd just like to comment on before we turn to questions. We've got one coming from the audience, so if anyone does have any questions, just pop them into the chat. So I mean, obviously it's great that Ireland's kind of almost exceeded the targets for 2020. So that's obviously a very sort of exciting outlook in terms of hitting targets as well. But as you said, a lot of work to be done. I think also the kind of the way that the DS3 model was implemented is certainly it provides a lot of good learnings for other markets and for other countries, definitely, and particularly for GB as well. So I guess we'll turn to questions first, and then I'll ask some of my questions. So we have one. So Frank, you mentioned, this is from Nick Cook. So Frank mentioned a requirement for 10-day storage by 2050. Do you have any idea as to which technology might be the preferred technology chosen for this?
Yeah, I think that something like green hydrogen is probably going to be the way forward for very long duration. So you'll use renewable energy, particularly excess renewable energy, because there will be times when the output from wind and solar will be greater than the demand is. And you can use that to break down water into hydrogen and oxygen and store the hydrogen. So that's something that has become a big talking point really over the last year or so. So you can store the hydrogen, and then you can you can both use that hydrogen for heat and transport, which is one of the things we're trying to do in terms of electrification of heat and transport. But also you could store it and then use a gas engine to actually produce electricity back again.
Great, thank you, Frank. And another question from one of the audience members in terms of how do you specify duration for a battery energy storage project in Ireland? So obviously the DS3 services only require short duration, but they're not guaranteed past 2023. And then it goes on to say a longer duration, 2 hours or greater, would be more flexible in wholesale trading. So I don't know who wants to lead on that question, perhaps Bernice?
Yeah, I can have a stab at it to start anyway. Yeah, it's a good question. And I guess where the market's at today is that the payments, the DS3 tariff framework is such that, you know, a half-hour battery makes sense today. But that will evolve over time, and certainly we will need to move to longer duration storage. And if you look at any kind of modelling for 2030, you know, the numbers are certainly north of a gigawatt of storage will be part of that system. When they will come on and what will underpin their business cases is an interesting question. So you need to look at what you think is going to happen to the fast reserves market post 2023. You need to look at what you think is going to happen to the capacity market, and you need to look at what you think is going to happen to the wholesale market, and, you know, how much you see there an ability to do arbitrage and balancing in that market. So there's a lot of factors. It's the whole price stack question again. So you basically need to model the market, and then of course you have to look at the capex curves for the batteries and see what you think is going to happen there. So they're all going to meet. It's going to be a point where there's going to be a happy place at a 2 hour or a 4 hour at some stage in the next few years, and I guess that's the name of the game for developers in Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the questions that I did want to ask was, what do you both actually envisage for the post 2023 market? You know, obviously bearing in mind all of those factors that you have to take into account, what would you envisage?
Frank, go on.
Okay.
Crystal ball.
I think one of the drivers for a day ahead market, and one of the reasons why EirGrid is keen on a day ahead market, is that at the moment they have to pave all the plants that's available, whether they actually need it or not. And the amount of reserve and the amount of fast frequency response they need depends on how much wind there is, and this thing called SNSP, which is system non-synchronous penetration. So they're paying for more than they need. They want to be able to say, you know, tomorrow we need a certain amount because we know it's going to be windy or not windy, and the sun's going to shine, and this is what the demand curve is going to be. So if they do that just on a weekly basis, they lose that ability to be able to match what they're paying for with how much reserve and fast frequency response they need. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure to go for the day ahead, and I think that's probably what will actually come in. I think there'll be capacity payments for longer duration storage. There's some opportunity for arbitrage, you know, as Bernice talked about, but at the moment it doesn't make sense to put in, say, 2 hour or certainly more than 2 hour batteries. You simply won't get the money back in terms of the arbitrage. And I think there's a fundamental issue with the fact that energy prices are going to go down, because most of it's going to be, the marginal cost is going to be nearly zero a lot of the time. So the whole structure of payments in the electricity industry has to be re-looked at. And I think part of that will be more in terms of capacity payments. And there is capacity payments for, you know, megawatts of capacity that can provide energy over a long period of time. But I think there'll also have to be some kind of capacity payments for standby plants, for, well, not so much standby, but for plants that can provide system services as well as plant that can actually provide energy. And so I think there'll be a fundamental change to the market will be required if they want to have enough energy storage on the system to be able to provide all the facilities that are needed, particularly long duration, because that might only be needed for, maybe once or twice a year. So how are the people going to actually get their money back?
You're on mute, Lucy, maybe, are you?
Sorry. Yeah, no, I was going to say definitely. Thanks for that, Frank. Any comments or any additions to your thoughts on the future market, Bernice?
Yeah, no, I think Frank's got it. There's definitely the move to the shorter term market, and I think it's just a question of timing. I do believe that it's not going to be ready in April 2023. Knowing how long the system changes have taken, for example, the transition in Ireland to ISM in recent years. Once you're touching those market systems, the amount of kind of, checking and testing that needs to be done is very onerous. So I just feel that if we get to a point where there's a high level decision this year, then that has to go into detailed design, then that has to go into implementation. It's quite a long process. So I think we're going there. I think the main issue I see is timing. I don't think it's going to be 2023.
When do you think it, sorry, go on, Frank. I was going to say, when do you think it would be, if not 2023?
If I saw the kind of high level decision this year, then I think it could be running a year late. It could be 2024. But given what we saw in ISM, what we saw on the DS3, the original framework, everything ran a couple of years late. It's just very time consuming when you get into the detail of these kind of systems. So I think minimum a year late is what I see.
Yeah.
And Frank, did you have something to add?
Yeah, the existing arrangements will allow for 2 extensions of 18 months each. So the existing tariff arrangements could continue for an additional 3 years. Without having to go back, get new legislation, new rules or anything like that. So I would say Bernice is right. It's going to be at least a year. I would say it's probably going to be 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, fair enough. So Bernice, I'm aware you have to jump off in a couple of minutes. So I'll just quickly pose this question in case you want to get involved. So do you think there's enough incentive for energy storage developers in Ireland, given the uncertainty of DS3 post 2023 at the moment? We think kind of more needs to be done, considering difficulties and costs associated with developing.
Yeah, I think the issue with a new development in Ireland at the moment is that there's quite a big pipeline out there. So there's 2 gigawatts of projects with planning. There's close to a gigawatt probably at this stage with grid. There's 400 megawatts building. So when you kind of work your way through the pipeline, it's a very competitive market, similar to what happened in GB. There's a lot of projects out there looking for a route to market or investment decision. I don't think the incentive is there today in terms of fast reserves, just because as I mentioned, that kind of expenditure note from EirGrid, the fact that the technical requirement is met this year. So now you have to really see what this enduring arrangement or future arrangement looks like, I think, before you're plugging any numbers in for your revenues from the fast reserve market, at least. Then, I guess on top of that, you need to understand what's happening in the capacity market in Ireland, what that means for a longer duration battery. It's not material for a short duration battery because of the derating factors which are applied, but it is, more material for a 2 hour or 4 hour case. So that can be looked at. and obviously the modelling of those trading revenues. Again, another new market. You know, we've seen this few scarcity events here in January, like you did in GB, with really spiky prices, but that's a rare occasion. And do we really know enough about the market to know what that looks like, you know, for an ongoing business case? They're the challenges, I think, that face a developer now, without a long line of sight on reserve revenues.
Yeah, definitely. Frank, anything to add if you were a developer?
No, I think Bernice has covered it all. I think the gates closed kind of at the moment. People that have got in early, that's good, but it's hard to see additional development over the next number of years.
Yeah, so I guess it kind of remains to be seen, as you've sort of been saying. So yeah, Bernice has to drop off now. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. So we'll carry on with you, Frank. We've got a couple more. So we had a question. So just going back to when you mentioned the market moving towards, you know, in 2023, a day ahead market, and a more short-term reserve. So what implications will that have on the current assets supplying DS3?
I think the revenues will go down because people will have to bid in, you know, day ahead, and not every day will everybody be needed. So, you know, people will be bidding in competitive prices to be in the market. I think it depends on how many plants are built. You know, there are a number of plants that are being built at the moment that are actually being built and will definitely go ahead. There are a lot of other ones in the pipeline. I'd say it's a bit unlikely that those ones will go ahead over the next number of years. But if they did, that would make it an even more competitive market. So, you know, I think the revenues are going to go down. I think that's where people are starting to look at putting in, say, 2-hour batteries. And people that are now developing rather than are at the development stage rather than the building stage. I think I'd say they are looking at 2-hour batteries maybe, so that they can try and get some revenue from capacity and some revenue from energy arbitrage, for the days that they don't get into the market for system services.
And yeah, so just I guess one question from me as we kind of round off the session. I hope that it's been helpful for anyone, you know, looking into the Irish market and looking to develop in, as you say, quite a saturated and competitive market, with, you know, some uncertainties coming up. So what, you know, with the potential move to day ahead market in Ireland, where are the other markets that you could kind of take learnings from? So obviously I imagine that, you know, you would look to GB for quite a lot of learnings, and vice versa. What learnings can GB take from Ireland as well?
I think Ireland and GB have taken a slightly different route. I'd say Ireland was probably a bit ahead in the system services market than GB if you go back 5-6 years ago. But then I think the GB market stole a march on us because they got out the EFR product, and now they're looking at, you know, the stability pathfinder and various things for inertia. So I think the approach that's been taken in GB is, look, we have a particular problem here. We need a particular product. Let's get that out into the market, and then separately we have another problem. Let's get some other product out into the market. Whereas I think Ireland has tried to incorporate everything into one single model, to have one comprehensive model for system services, and that has just taken an awful long time to do. So I think one of the things we can learn from GB is, you know, get on with this in steps rather than trying to do it all. And maybe what the GB market can learn from us is, you know, how does this all fit together? How do all the different bits and pieces fit together in the longer term? I think what we can also learn from the GB market is that there's been a lot of stacking of revenues, you know, from different kinds of things. So there's been capacity, and there's been, say, EFR, and there's been the ability to, you know, reduce peaks, and all of those things So there may be 2 or 3 different revenue streams, and I think that's something we need to look at more in Ireland. And it's possibly where batteries behind the meter come in, where you might have a wind farm or a solar farm, and they have a battery behind the meter, and they're using it at times to take up the excess wind or solar generation, and give it back at a time when the prices are higher. And it also means those particular batteries, as well as doing that, can also provide system services at other times, and maybe can provide, if they have longer duration, maybe can get a revenue from capacity as well. So I think that's one thing we can learn from them, and not to be so focused just on DS3.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as you say, it's interesting how they kind of started off down a similar route and then kind of veered off. So yeah, certainly lots of learnings there. So we just have one more question in relation to the DS3. So prices were very, very competitive, and some are questioning how these can be financially viable. Are the 110 megawatts of volume cap projects at risk because of bidding in very low prices?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've all been thinking that. I'm not sure what the answer is. I gather that they're going ahead, that the plants are being built or are going to be built. But I think we were all shocked at the prices that came in. It's hard to see people making money out of it. But then I think we were all shocked when we saw the EFR prices in GB as well, and we thought, how could anybody make money out of those? But those plants were built too, so it's hard to know.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Frank. I think we've answered everybody's questions. So I guess just from me, a big thank you. I think that was a really, really interesting session. I'm sure if anyone does have any further questions, then they can reach out to Frank, and he'll be happy to answer any more. I guess just one more question. So we talked about it kind of briefly, with the move to long duration applications in Ireland, what's your kind of outlook or your view on that?
I think the very long duration is some years away. I don't think we necessarily need it now. I mean, at the moment, effectively the peaking is provided by peaking plants, peaking fossil generation. I suppose as we get into our climate action plan more, if the price of carbon goes up enough, then that might drive it from that into more into energy storage. I think it's going to be very difficult for anybody to develop a project like pump storage, because the capital costs are so high, and nobody's going to build something like that just on a market, on a day ahead market, or an energy arbitrage. So I think there are some strategic long duration projects that are probably needed from the country's point of view, and I think some additional market mechanism will have to be found to actually make those work. So it may be something like a 20-year contract, or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I agree. Obviously, the whole world, global markets are talking about long duration. So you've got to kind of keep ahead of the curve, but obviously, keep in touch with the actual market and what it's kind of offering and what it's asking for. Okay, so I think in the absence of any more questions, we'll leave it there. And thank you very, very much, Frank. I really enjoyed that session. And we will go for a break now. So we've got an hour of networking. So everybody feel free to join the session. It's open to all, and you can join by simply clicking the link on your agenda, and you'll be able to have interactions with all of the other delegates on the portal. So thanks again, Frank, and thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll see you later on back at 3:30. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Bye-bye.
Cheers.